It's great to have you, ma'am, for the Interspecies movement by Atria. I am looking forward to having a great conversation with you, and I'm sure our viewers will get a lot of insight about you and your brand and how it's being more biodiversity friendly. Good evening, ma'am. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I know that you have spent the last couple of years in scientific research towards conservation and biodiversity, and how we can make people more aware about this, and also about your brand, the Black Baza Coffee. Before getting into about your work and projects, I just wanted to know about your journey, how you got into the space of conservation.
So, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, I run a social and conservation enterprise called Black Baza Coffee that works with smallholder coffee growers across the Western Ghats of India on biodiversity friendly farming. And the problem that we're all trying to solve collectively is how can we actually grow and market a product like coffee in a way that conserves local ecosystems and biodiversity. Coffee has historically not been grown in this manner at all. Most coffee production systems are very extractive from nature. Vast areas of rainforest across the world have been converted to coffee plantation. And of course, most growers, and in India, 83% of people who cultivate coffee cultivate on half an acre or 1 acre or 5 acres. So really, really small parcels of land are hugely exploited by the market at the worst, but at the best, perhaps that the coffee market doesn't serve them or serve their interest. And so both of these questions is what we're trying to look at. And I found myself running an enterprise quite by accident, because I'm a human geographer and a social scientist by training. And a lot of my work before Black Baza was to really look at doing research, particularly qualitative research with farming communities and indigenous communities across India. And it's from that lens of research that I think one of the biggest turning points was studying very deeply what sustainability certifications are and coming to a realization that there were a lot of missed opportunities in how we've designed sustainable supply chains, and that certifications by themselves don't necessarily achieve the kind of environmental or social transformation that they could. And we sort of founded Black Baza on the principle of wanting to build an alternative to that mainstream model. And so for me, that journey has also been one of transition from academic to entrepreneur.
Ma'am, I just wanted to know that Black Baza Coffee is considered as India's first biodiversity friendly coffee brand. So I just wanted to know, what does it mean to be a biodiversity friendly brand, and what are the steps that you have to take to make sure it is one?
Yeah, I mean, we don't quite say that in the same way anymore, even though that might be true, but that's not, being the first wasn't necessarily something that we felt could or should be a tagline. But we try and remain as true to our goal of conserving biodiversity on an everyday level. And what we mean by that is there's a few different steps that go into it. And the first step is very much still that of research. So the first step of, I think, trying to understand how one might conserve biodiversity on coffee farms is really understanding, what does conserving biodiversity mean? What do we mean by biodiversity? Different people have different understandings of what species should be valued, what species should be conserved, what species are endangered, threatened, what species hold agricultural value, what species hold cultural value. And it's those dialogues that we have in communities that who we source from, who we partner with, that actually form the first collective understanding of what kind of farming practice is good for certain species, what kind of farming practice is not as good for certain species. And we have, through that research, I think, developed, at least for one particular region of the BR Hills in Karnataka, an understanding of what might be the tree and animal and insect species that we think are really crucial for that landscape. And that is bees, it's beetles, it's earthworms, it's 4 tree species, 4 forest and native tree species, and 2 species of birds and a few species of mammals. So now we have what we might say indicator species, or our local keystone species that the community there is interested in looking at a conservation practice for, but also a monitoring practice for. And that's what we mean by biodiversity-friendly coffee. It really is rooted in that particular local ecosystem, understanding what might be the farming guidelines that actually serve particular species there. From a consumer level, it's quite interesting to kind of understand that as well. So first, I mean, we realized very on that both from a consumer perspective and from a biodiversity perspective, that coffee had to be grown without any chemical pesticide or fertilizer. So that is, of course, something that's at the basis of what is a biodiversity-friendly practice. But over and above that, we're really also trying to look at what is the native vegetation that exists on coffee farms beyond coffee. What's the diversity of tree species? How is the coffee farm as ecologically complex as the surrounding forest is, rather than a much more intensified farming practice where actually ecologically farms can be quite simple. We want an ecologically complex farm because it's complexity that really hosts species of all different shapes and sizes. So for us, that's the crucial and the first sort of starting point of what we mean by cultivating a farming practice that's biodiversity friendly. The interesting thing is that differs landscape to landscape and geography to geography. And being an enterprise that is in some ways directly connected to a consumer allows us to adapt as we go, right? Which is the big difference or the big departure from what a certification system might be, which is very much a one-size-fits-all approach, whether I'm cultivating coffee in Brazil or Vietnam or Kenya or India, right? Where it's not subjective as much as how can I best represent the local reality and the historical and social context of where I'm growing coffee. And that has to be different. And that has to really be best reflective of what geography you're in, which is something that being an enterprise and being a brand allows us to do. And I think that's where really the kind of innovation piece comes in as well.
So basically, when we talk about other agro brands, like probably the bigger agro brands that are out there, do you see in the future them also trying to be more sustainable or trying to take a more sustainable approach with their farming and cultivation after looking at smaller brands like you?
What's funny is that I do think a lot of people people keep asking us around this issue of scale. Because fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, a lot of interesting initiatives stay small, right? And the question is always, well, the scale of our challenges is huge, whether we look at biodiversity loss or we look at the livelihood insecurity that increasingly many producer communities face across. The scale of challenges is huge. Why is the scale of the solution ending up being small? And there's bits of that I resonate with as well. But I do think quite a lot of the very large industry players do watch us and do watch other smaller brands like us and enterprises like us. Because for them, it's always, I think, the sort of setting of a standard of what industry can do or can be. And, the hope is, I think, and actually many of them are also quite open to having a dialogue. And I think the hope is that, not just that their narrative will change, so not that that sustainability will become lip service, but actually how can that be part and parcel of a supply chain, right? And I think those are the conversations that we need to have, because right now we think of biodiversity conservation as being a kind of part of what the CSR arm or a CSR wing of an organization or a large corporation might do. But actually, it's good supply chain management. It makes good business sense. If we think really of how we're treating stakeholders, both human, not human. And I think that's what I think increasingly large businesses will watch us for.
Yeah, so let's dive into the question of the hour today, the conference about the interspecies currency movement. What we are talking about is about creating a digital twin of every creature and attaching a commercial value to it in order to conserve it. Uh, how do you envision conveying a message or a concept like this to the local communities or to the tribal communities? Do you see or do you foresee any challenges or hurdles there, since you also have worked with local farmers and you would know how that would go?
That's a great question, and I think I perhaps foresee a fair number of challenges. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier today, but I think is worthwhile saying, is that the nature of market is quite different in this description of what an interspecies value chain might look like, or a platform might look like. And for a lot of the partner producers we work with, the market has always been a place where they can go and wag their finger and have a real dialogue, have an animated debate about what the price of my coffee should be 50 rupees more per kilo, not what you're kind of giving me. So there's always been an active negotiation. A marketplace is that. It's a space for negotiating price. It's a space for negotiating quality of what produce is. And one of the concerns that I have perhaps with this kind of concept is, how do you bring in those negotiations in a way that producers can engage directly with consumers? Because that's what the opportunity of technology is, right? To actually connect directly producers and consumers. And I think that would be an interesting exercise to think about, how do I bring that negotiation into a conversation or a framework like interspecies money, and then allow for those negotiations to still be there. Because if I'm unable to access the market, then it's not serving me. If I'm unable to go and fight for the quality and value of my produce, then the market is not serving me. And I think that's the same for many of the concepts that maybe this framework entails. So I think, I think there's challenges of translation, but there's also some of these, like, I think, deeper conceptual things that we can debate about more.
So, ma'am, now actually I would like to talk a little bit about conservation education, because I feel at the grassroots level, if students or if young minds are more empathetic and sensitive towards conservation, that can lead to a better future where people are more aware about biodiversity and saving the conservation and climate change as well. So we here at Atria University actually practice a interdisciplinary STEMs education system, where we focus on project-based learning, which is basically learned by doing. So do you think students who come out of education systems like Atria can be future leaders of movement like the Interspecies Conclave?
I mean, I think they can be future conservation leaders and champions for sure. And I mean, I think education plays the most crucial role, especially an education that actually does teach or lead on things about being compassionate citizens, looking at what space, who else shares space with me, human, not human. I think those are precisely the questions that the earlier we start asking and the earlier we start acknowledging that we share space, that our food comes from spaces that are also shared. It's not just my rice that I'm eating, but actually that rice comes from an ecosystem and a producer where there's a whole bunch of different species that coexist, right? I think those are precisely the kind of ways that conservation can be made compelling to us as citizens, rather than as something that you care about at a certain age once you suddenly watch a particular documentary on National Geographic or something like that. I don't think we need to wait for that long for us to really start being much more compassionate about who else we share the planet with.
Thank you so much, ma'am. For the last question today, I just wanted to know, where do you envision Black Baza Coffee to be in the next 10 years, and what do you think of the conservation sector is going to be in India in the next 10 years?
That's a really good question. And I mean, it's a question that keeps me awake at night as well. I know in the short and medium term, we're, as an organization, really kind of trying to diversify as much as possible. So expand in geography from across the Western Ghats to other parts of India. I mentioned Northeast India, but also expand beyond coffee, because at our basic root, the essence is we're looking at produce and products that come out that are sold as commodities. But how do you decommodify them? And how do you embed these commodities in their ecological and people history? And there's many different ways to experiment with that beyond coffee, right? And so that's kind of what our short and medium term is, that we'd like to really expand the scope of work that we do. But I think in the long term, we'd also really like to build an alternative of how farming can actually be sustainable, ecologically sustainable. I think we've accepted for too long that the only way that the market can run is by exploiting and extracting from the earth and people. And I think it's about time that we show that alternatives exist and alternatives are possible. And how do we build a space for that, and an organization that imbibes that is crucial. We're also looking beyond biodiversity in a way, because I think a space for an alternative and equal kind of playing field involves other things, right? So we are a women-run organization. For that's always been crucial. How do we involve women far more in the work that we're doing? When we think of a farmer, we think of a man, but most produce is grown by women. Women, for example, with coffee, women nurture the plants, pick the coffee fruit when they're ripe. Women harvest and dry coffee, and yet every training program that has ever been done, either by the state or by anybody, involves only men. And so those, I think, are the fundamental pieces that we need to change in order to really build a genuine alternative. And we can't look at biodiversity alone. We can't look at livelihood alone. We can't look at gender alone. I think all of that has to really enmesh into something bigger.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us your time. And we really loved having the conversation with you. And it was quite insightful and interesting. And I look forward to having you over more often. And we would love to see your roastery one day.
Thank you. Please come to our roastery. And thank you for having me to chat with you.
Thanks a lot.